Welcome to a new episode of our podcast, Lead the Future, Change the Conversation, an unedited and honest conversation to create the future. I'm Arjan Visser, the futurist and your host today. And join me as I chat with my dear friend Ryan Rigterink on leadership, future, and peers. The name is always funny. Ryan, I will say it again, Rigterink is the founder of Leaders Ops and a keynote speaker navigating the intersection of purpose and profit for the future workplace. Welcome, Ryan. I'm really honored to have you back on the podcast.
Well, likewise. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, what are we going to talk about? Leadership, future, peers. What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Well, my first thing that comes to mind is what you said in the intro, which is unedited, right? So um, I think leadership starts with authenticity instead of the edited, scrubbed up version that is sometimes portrayed. So that's my first thought. But that's probably because this is an unedited, no do over live we're doing. So,
Yeah, yeah. It's the pressure of leadership. You have to do it. No, don't have to do it right. You know, we always say leadership is modeling learning, which we all know by failing fast, by being transparent about what works and what didn't work. The best leaders are presented. You know, so but yeah, it's unedited, so we can only do this once. And if people like it and they are nice with their comments, then we all have another podcast in the future together. Um,
yeah. So self leadership, we've talked about this a lot in our conversations offline, but I think it starts with self leadership. All leadership starts with self leadership. So it's the birthplace of finding your voice, right? Is I think a couple of those things working together is instrumental. So
it is authenticity, authority, maturity. Things easier said than done. Like they're not a position, they're not an achievement. They are progress. They are a journey, and absolutely, a leader is interesting to follow if he's showing or opening up about self leadership that is happening behind the scene, that's happening on the inside, and that is shown on the outside.
yeah, absolutely. I think the question kind of I've posed before is, would you follow you? It's kind of that self leadership piece, reality check from outside perspective, right? It's how are we showing up? Are we interesting to follow? Would we want to follow ourselves? A lot within that question. So
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting one, because I think we should not ask ourselves too many times. You know, being afraid of the answer in some circumstances. Let's be honest. Like you're not. It is hard to look in the mirror. Self-reflection is essential, but it is a tough job, and but it is so needed.
yeah,
Like, we hear so many people, leaders that cross boundaries. And the only thing I could think is, besides inappropriate behavior, is, did they actually set their own boundaries, like connected to self leadership? Do they recognize their own boundaries? Because if the answer to those two questions is no, then how could we expect to recognize someone else's boundaries and respect them? Like,
yeah,
that is totally impossible. And we live in an age where everything is inappropriate behavior. But to be honest, Besides the ugly stories and the dirt, besides that, if we talk about would I follow myself, then I would say I need to do a bit more work on knowing my own boundaries, living up to my own boundaries, and respect, not respecting, but recognizing them from others. Like, I think
Yeah. And I think respect
inherently,
is a good word there too. So
yeah, but wouldn't we be like, with the starting point that most of us want to do good, I think we have no problem respecting them. But we missed that step before, recognizing them.
yeah, I think there's, based on the level of maturity, there's probably challenges at multiple levels there, depending on the person, right? Challenge recognizing, if we don't recognize our own, how can we recognize somebody else's? If we don't respect our own and actually follow through and live them, then we're probably more likely to do that to others as well. So I think they go hand in hand. Circling back to something you said a minute ago, about it's hard to look in the mirror at times, and like, I think most people might hear that in the negative, right? But I think it's equally true in the positive. If we're filled with hope and a vision and something we're pursuing, and there's a gap between where we are and who we are now, and where we know we're supposed to go and who we're supposed to be, that could be just as intimidating in the mirror of recognizing that gap.
Yeah. Yes. I totally like. I think you're absolutely right. It's not about the negative or the positive. It's about being real. And and we can be modest about ourselves. We can be over celebrating ourselves. And we don't want to be too modest. We don't want to be too celebrative. But there is a huge space in between, which we I would call life, which we should maximize in that sense. So looking in the mirror, self-reflection, you know, would not advise it to do it daily, but there is a routine, there is a repetitive pattern, like every once in a while it's needed. It brings you to the next growth cycle. It finishes the current growth cycle. It gives focus and adjustment for the next growth cycle. So it is
Yeah,
needed.
yeah, it's definitely needed. When you were saying fall off one side or the other, I think that's an interesting perspective in terms of how much space is in the middle. Like, I think to a lot of people that might feel like a tightrope, but that can be a pretty expansive place if we're actually thankful, and we're like, I think that can be a tightrope based kind of on our religious mindset, but the reality is that could be a wide open field of who we are and who we could be, if we stay in gratitude and in hopefulness and keep a right posture. That can be a really broad space instead of a tightrope.
And actually, what the word that comes to mind, and it's been mentioned already by you, is maturity. A maturity from the inside out. And emotional intelligence is definitely a major key, um, in it. But it comes from the self leadership. Like you said, there is no leadership without self leadership. Well, there should
Well,
be
there
no
is.
leadership without self leadership.
I was gonna say, I think there's a lot of that actually.
Well, to be honest, there isn't a lot of leadership out there. There is a lot of
Yeah,
executive functions out there, and
yeah,
and there is a lot of management out there. But could there be leadership without self leadership? That's the question. Like, how many leadership styles are there? Well, what if there's only one leadership style, which is the authentic, healthy leadership that reveals you from the inside out? because the rest
Yeah.
feels like some kind of a code that isn't yours.
Yeah. So how I think about this is there's probably one type of self leadership, but I think there's multiple types of leadership. So I tend to think of that as more of an interactionist form of leadership, where instead of like a one size fits all unicorn of the best form of leadership, it's actually it's how do we actually engage with the context and lead in that space in the best optimal way. And that, I think, looks different based on the point in time, the context, what's needed, what's the objective, right? So I think some of this one size fits all leadership style stuff is quite honestly seeing its day, and hopefully we're starting to move past. So
Let's, before we fill too much time, short conversations, but let's be brutally honest. Self-leadership. How do you prioritize self-leadership development?
wow, how do I prioritize it? My sarcastic, blunt response is high.
Yeah.
No, I think it's prioritized practically in a lot of different ways. It has to do with how I operate in business and engage in relationships. Prioritizing self-control and prioritizing how I show up to the people I care about and those I don't. So I think, how it's a difficult question to answer, quite honestly. How do I prioritize self-leadership? Well, honestly, your mastermind's been a huge part of that in terms of self-leadership. At least how I think about it is about finding our voice and creating the future, and taking an intentional approach to pursuing that. So I think self-leadership, you can be stuck in the past, you can be sort of stuck in neutral, or you can be proactively pursuing the future and creating who you're meant to become and what you're meant to do. So I think that for me is deliberate discovery. It's deliberate, intentional experimentation. I think it's also forgiveness in terms of the stuff from the past, right? So I think there's a lot of different components in self-leadership and how they have to show up. And forgiveness can be for the person in the mirror too, right? So that's sometimes the hardest person to forgive. So
yeah. Well, the mirror becomes a central theme in our conversation. But actually, to take that analogy, surrounding myself with peers that I give permission to give me blunt feedback, be brutally honest to me. So I give myself permission to be vulnerable to them. And in most of the cases, the feedback that's most constructive is them holding up actually a mirror and saying, like, this is the language you are developing. This is how it feels listening to you. Is this really who you want to become? Is this
yeah,
really doing justice to who you are? And
yeah,
it's that sibling dynamic without the envy, and it is
yep,
those close friends. I would nearly say business partners, because there we are, or purpose partners, if that word exists, because there is this deep desire to see each other grow,
yeah,
but not with having a stake in it. So there is never the envy, the sense of lack,
right,
or um, or feeling pressure that the other one is growing, so now I have to grow. What you see in business settings with leaders that are surrounded by a good group of um, team members, like management team members. But there is a hierarchy in a relationship that in the good days it works, but the moment it gets tough, there is not
Yeah.
that honest feedback, you know.
Yeah, there can be competing values there in terms of being able to be truly raw. And I mean, the interesting thing about the context you're talking about in terms of the mastermind and getting around people is there's permission to be more vulnerable, and there's permission by modeling it to one another and giving the type of feedback, both positive and negative, that's just raw and honest, but always with the intent to help and really spur each other on. It's a safe space. If I don't know if I even like that language, but it creates a space where there's not concern over what people think, or there's a permission to experiment and try on new language and to try out what seems to fit or not and get feedback loops. I think as much as it's creating the future and the language for the future, I think really what I've benefited from is I think it's acceleration towards maturity, leadership maturity. I think that I think is kind of, if I would boil it all down to one thing, it's like the context is pursuing the future, but I think like the kernel of the benefit has been accelerating me. It's been finding the voice, but also getting the feedback loop and working through the blind spots and the dark spots and pulling me into what resonates, and observing observations about myself and feeding back language that actually complements and expands what I've said, and hearing even what I've said from other people in terms of what they heard is it's really interesting, because it's not just sharing, it's
progress.
Yeah, it's progress. It's incremental progress and acceleration. It's essentially the incubator of maturity and self-leadership, I think is what I've experienced anyhow. So, and I think that's circling back to what we've been talking about in terms of broader context of leadership. I think that's what's missing in hierarchy, missing in most organizations, honestly, is not the intentionality, the structure, and the space to do that. So,
and we talked about prioritizing self-leadership development by setting time apart. It is stepping out of the operational issues to work on yourself, because you deserve
absolutely.
it. And that is different than being or staying in the context of all operational priorities and urgencies. So to wrap it up, you mentioned it already. If you're out there listening and you think, oh, actually, I want to find my voice, then the invitation is still open to just sit in as a guest and discover your PR mastermind. And that could be this Friday. So, Ryan, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
It was a pleasure. So, if no one posts a negative comment, we will be talking again, definitely online too. So, thank you very much.
Sounds good. Thank you.
And till the next podcast.